The December wind carried the scent of roasted chestnuts through the narrow streets of Lisbon as Emre stood at the window of his modest apartment in Alfama, watching the city prepare for Christmas with a mixture of contentment and the perpetual homesickness that never quite faded even after 5 years of living in Portugal. He had built something here, something his own, far from the suffocating expectations of his wealthy family in Istanbul, far from the grandmother's whispers about suitable marriages and the cousins who measured success only in zeros on bank statements. His small import business dealing in specialty foods had grown steadily, providing him with enough comfort to rent this apartment with its terracotta tiles and azulejo-covered walls, with its view of the Tagus River that reminded him, on certain golden evenings, of the Bosphorus he had left behind. But the greatest treasure his Portuguese life had given him was not the business or the apartment or even the freedom from familial judgment. It was Beatriz, the Brazilian woman who had crashed into his life like a summer storm 8 months ago and had somehow never left. She had been working at a cafe in Chiado when he first saw her, her dark curls escaping from a loose bun, her laugh carrying across the room like music he didn't know he had been waiting to hear, her Portuguese flowing with that Brazilian warmth that made the language sound like honey rather than the more formal European variant. They had talked for 3 hours that first day, discovering shared passions for obscure cinema and Mediterranean cooking and long walks through cities at dawn. And by the time the cafe closed, Emre had known with a certainty that frightened him that his carefully constructed solitary life was about to change forever. Beatriz had come to Lisbon chasing dreams of becoming a photographer, escaping her own complicated family situation in São Paulo, and perhaps it was this shared understanding of what it meant to love your roots while needing distance from them that had bonded them so quickly and so deeply. Now she practically lived in his apartment, her cameras scattered across the living room table, her coffee mugs with Brazilian flags perpetually half full on every surface, her presence woven into the fabric of his daily existence so thoroughly that he could no longer imagine the space without her laughter echoing off the old walls. He had told his family nothing about her, maintaining the fiction that he was too busy with work to think about relationships, deflecting his mother's increasingly insistent questions about marriage with vague promises to visit soon, to bring home a nice Turkish girl from the community in Lisbon to make her proud. The lie sat heavy in his stomach every time he spoke to his mother on video calls, positioning the camera carefully so she wouldn't see Beatriz's photography books on the shelf behind him, so she wouldn't notice the women's jacket hanging by the door, so she wouldn't hear the Brazilian music that was always playing softly somewhere in the apartment. He knew he was being a coward, knew that his fear of confrontation was dishonest to both the women in his life. But every time he imagined telling his mother, telling Sheriff Yilmaz, the formidable matriarch who had single-handedly managed the family's textile business after his father's death, and had opinions about everything from the correct way to brew tea to the appropriate ethnicity of a daughter-in-law, his throat would close, and the words would die before they reached his lips. His mother was not a cruel woman, he would tell himself. She was simply traditional, simply protective, simply convinced that she knew what was best for her only son. And perhaps if he could just find the right moment, the right words, the right way to introduce the idea gradually, she would come to accept Beatriz the way he had come to love her. That fantasy of the perfect revelation shattered on December 22nd, when his phone rang at 7 in the morning and his mother's voice announced, with the casual authority of someone who had never in her life considered that her plans might be inconvenient to others, that she was at the Lisbon airport and would be arriving at his apartment within the hour. The world seemed to tilt beneath Emre's feet as he processed her words, as Beatriz stirred beside him in bed and murmured something sleepy in Portuguese. As his mother continued talking about how she had decided on a whim to surprise him for Christmas, because what kind of mother lets her son spend the holidays alone in a foreign country, because she had been worried about him, because she needed to see with her own eyes that he was eating properly and taking care of himself. He managed to mumble something about being happy to see her, while his mind raced through the implications, through the logistics of hiding an entire relationship in the space of an hour, through the impossibility of explaining to Beatriz why she suddenly needed to disappear from her own home. When he ended the call, his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the phone twice before setting it on the nightstand, and when Beatriz asked what was wrong, her accent thick with sleep, he found himself saying words he would later be ashamed of. His mother was coming, right now, and she couldn't be here, couldn't know, couldn't find out about them yet because it would ruin everything, because his mother would never understand, because he needed time to prepare her for the idea of a foreign girlfriend, because please, could she just go to her friend's place for a few days while he figured out how to handle this? The hurt in Beatriz's eyes, as she understood what he was asking, was something that would haunt him through the days that followed. A wound he had inflicted with his cowardice that no amount of apologetic texts or whispered phone calls could fully heal. She had agreed eventually because she loved him and because she understood familial complexity better than most, but she had made it clear that this arrangement had an expiration date, that she would not be hidden away like something shameful forever, that if he truly loved her the way he claimed, he would find the courage to tell his mother the truth. As she packed a small bag with efficient, wounded movements, Emre had promised that he would tell his mother after Christmas, that he just needed to get through the initial visit, that everything would be different once his mother was back in Istanbul and he could control the narrative. And even as he said these things, some part of him knew he was lying to himself as much as to her. Beatriz had kissed him goodbye at the door, a kiss that tasted like tears and disappointment, and then she was gone, and Emre was alone in an apartment that suddenly felt hollow without her presence, frantically gathering her belongings, the photography books, the coffee mugs, the jacket by the door, the Brazilian flag magnet on the refrigerator, and hiding them in the closet of the spare room like evidence of a crime. By the time the doorbell rang an hour later, the apartment had been sanitized of any trace of Beatriz's existence, and Emre had composed his face into an expression of surprised delight that he hoped would fool the woman who had known him since before he could speak. Sheriff Yilmaz swept into the apartment like a force of nature, her designer luggage rolling behind her, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the long flight, her sharp eyes already cataloguing every detail of her son's home and finding, no doubt, countless things to criticize. She was 73 years old, but moved with the energy of someone decades younger, her wealth evident in the quality of her cashmere coat and the diamond studs in her ears, her authority evident in the way she immediately began rearranging the furniture and commenting on the inadequacy of his kitchen setup, and asking when was the last time he had eaten a proper home-cooked meal. Emre embraced her, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, Chanel No. 5, always, since as long as he could remember, and felt the complicated love he had for her tangle with the guilt of what he was hiding. She had traveled all this way to see him, had disrupted her own holiday plans to ensure he wasn't alone, had done what she had always done, which was to love him with an intensity that sometimes felt more like possession than affection. As she settled onto his couch and began listing the ingredients she would need to cook a proper Turkish Christmas feast, as she asked about his business and his health, and whether he had been attending mosque and meeting any nice Turkish girls from the community, Emre felt the walls of his carefully constructed double life begin to close in around him. He had 3 days until Christmas, 3 days to maintain this charade, 3 days to figure out how to tell his mother about Beatriz without destroying either relationship. And as he watched her unpack photographs of distant relatives and traditional decorations she had brought from Istanbul, he wondered if he had the strength to do what he knew he needed to do, or if he would simply continue to be the coward he had always been when it came to confronting this woman who loved him too much and understood him not at all. The first full day with his mother in the apartment became an exhausting exercise in vigilance and misdirection, every moment fraught with the potential for discovery, every innocent question from Sheriff carrying the threat of unraveling the careful fiction Imre was attempting to maintain. He had barely slept the night before. Lying rigid on the couch, he had insisted his mother take the bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else breathing in his space. His mind cycling through all the ways his deception could be exposed. The long dark hair that might have escaped the vacuum cleaner. The faint scent of Beatrice's jasmine perfume that might still linger on the throw pillows. The photography magazines he might have forgotten to hide. The neighbors who might mention having seen him with a woman. Beatrice had texted him in the early hours, a simple message saying she missed him and asking how things were going, and he had typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on a bland reassurance that everything was fine, that his mother was settling in, that he would call her when he could. The dishonesty of that message had made him feel physically ill, the gap between what he was writing and what he was feeling so vast that the words seemed almost meaningless. His mother woke early, as she always did, and by the time Emre emerged from his restless attempt at sleep, she had already reorganized his kitchen cabinets, critiqued his coffee as too weak, and compiled a shopping list of ingredients she would need to prepare meals that would put some meat on his bones, because clearly he had been neglecting himself in this foreign country without a woman to look after him properly. The day unfolded as a series of small performances, each one requiring Emre to be someone he no longer entirely was, the dutiful Turkish son who agreed that yes, it was probably time he thought seriously about marriage, who nodded along when his mother praised the daughter of her friend from Istanbul who was also single and would make such a good match, who pretended interest in the photos she showed him of eligible young women from good families back home. Sherif had not changed since he had left Turkey 5 years ago, or perhaps she had changed in ways that made her more intensely herself, more certain of her opinions, more convinced of her right to direct her son's life, more lonely in the large Istanbul apartment since her sisters had died and her social world had contracted to bridge clubs and charity luncheons, and the eternal hope that Emre would come home and give her grandchildren to fuss over. He could see the loneliness beneath her criticisms, the love beneath her manipulation, and this understanding made it both harder and more necessary to tell her the truth about his life. They walked through Lisbon together that afternoon, his mother's arm linked through his, her running commentary on the city, a mixture of grudging admiration and reflexive comparison to Istanbul. The churches were impressive, but not as impressive as the mosques. The seafood was fresh, but not as fresh as what you could get at the Bosphorus. The people were friendly, but not as warm as Turks. Emre guided her carefully away from the cafe where he and Beatrice had met, away from the photography gallery where Beatrice's work was currently being shown, away from all the places that had become theirs over the past 8 months, and that now felt like landmines waiting to explode his carefully constructed narrative. His phone buzzed periodically with messages from Beatrice, photos of her friend's cat, observations about the weather, gentle reminders that she loved him even when he was being an idiot. And each time, he would glance at the screen and quickly pocket the phone before his mother could see, his heart racing with a mixture of guilt and longing that made it hard to breathe. At one point, passing a young couple holding hands on the Praça do Comércio, his mother had sighed dramatically and said how nice it must be to be young and in love, how she hoped Emre would experience that someday soon, and the irony was so sharp that he almost laughed, almost confessed everything right there in the Christmas-decorated square with the river sparkling behind them. But the moment passed, as such moments always did, swallowed by his mother's next observation about the pigeons or the tourists or the peculiar Portuguese habit of eating codfish in so many different preparations. That evening, while his mother napped in his bedroom, Emre called Beatrice from the tiny balcony overlooking the street, hunched against the December cold, speaking in whispers even though there was no way his mother could hear him through the closed door. Beatrice answered immediately, her voice carrying that particular quality of patience stretched thin that he was becoming far too familiar with. She told him about her day at her friend's apartment, about the photographs she had been editing, about the small Christmas tree her friend had put up that made her homesick for Sao Paulo, where her grandmother would be making rabanada and her cousins would be gathering for the midnight feast. Her voice softened when she asked about his mother, genuine curiosity beneath the hurt, wanting to understand this woman who had such power over the man she loved. Emre tried to describe Sherai fairly, tried to convey both her overwhelming nature and her genuine love, tried to explain why a 73-year-old Turkish widow with traditional values might struggle to accept a Brazilian daughter-in-law, tried to articulate the fear that had kept him silent for 8 months, without sounding as pathetic as he felt. Beatriz listened without interrupting, and when she finally spoke, her words were gentle but firm. She understood that families were complicated. She understood that cultural expectations were powerful. She understood that he loved his mother and didn't want to hurt her. But she could not, and would not be a secret forever. And if he couldn't find the courage to tell his mother about her, then perhaps he needed to examine what that said about his feelings and his future. The conversation left Imre shaken, standing on the balcony long after they had said goodbye, watching the lights of the city flicker on as darkness fell, feeling the weight of his divided loyalties pressing down on him like a physical burden. When he went back inside, his mother was awake and preparing dinner, moving through his kitchen with the proprietary confidence of someone who had spent her life commanding domestic spaces. And she looked at him with eyes that suddenly seemed far too knowing and asked if he was all right because he looked pale, looked troubled, looked like a man carrying secrets. He assured her he was fine, just tired from work, and helped her prepare the kurft and pilaf that filled the apartment with the smells of his childhood. And they ate together at his small table while she talked about the family back home, who had married, who had died, who had disgraced themselves with bad business decisions or unsuitable romantic choices. And Emre listened with half his attention while the other half remained with Beatriz, alone in a stranger's apartment, waiting for him to become the man she needed him to be. The second day followed a similar pattern, a careful choreography of avoidance and performance, his mother accompanying him to his small warehouse where he showed her the business he had built, her pride in his success tempered by her conviction that he could have been even more successful if he had stayed in Istanbul and worked for the family company. She met his employees, charmed his Portuguese business partner with her rusty but functional Portuguese learned decades ago from a family friend from Brazil, a detail that made Imre's blood run cold with the irony, and expressed skeptical approval of the life he had constructed for himself so far from home. At lunch at a traditional Portuguese restaurant, she asked again about his romantic prospects, about whether he had met anyone special, and Imre found himself spinning elaborate fictions about how busy he was, how focused on growing the business, how he hadn't found the right person yet, but was certainly open to the possibility. The lies came easier now, which terrified him, his ability to look his mother in the eye while denying Beatriz's existence becoming smoother with practice. That night, Beatriz sent him a photograph of the two of them from their trip to Sintra last month, their faces pressed together in front of the colorful Pina Palace, both of them laughing at something he could no longer remember, and beneath the image she had written simply, "This is real, remember that." He stared at the photograph for a long time, at the happiness in their faces, at the ease of their bodies together, at the life they had built that he was currently pretending didn't exist, and something shifted in his chest, some calculus of fear and love beginning to tip in a direction it hadn't before. Christmas Eve arrived with grey skies and the promise of rain, his mother busy in the kitchen preparing a fusion holiday meal that combined Turkish traditions with Portuguese ingredients she had discovered at the market, and Emre helped her cook, while his phone burned in his pocket with unread messages from Beatriz, while the pressure of his deception built to levels he wasn't sure he could sustain much longer. Christmas Eve dinner was set for 8 o'clock, an elaborate affair that his mother had been preparing since dawn, the apartment transformed into a fragrant temple of Turkish and Portuguese culinary fusion. The table set with dishes Imre had forgotten he owned, and candles his mother had purchased from a shop in Baksa that reminded her of one in the Grand Bazaar. Sherif had outdone herself, as she always did when she had something to prove, which in this case seemed to be that her son needed her, that he could not properly celebrate holidays without her intervention, that the distance between them was a wound she was determined to heal through sheer force of maternal will and butter-laden dishes. Imre had showered and dressed in clothes his mother approved of, a pressed shirt rather than his usual casual wear, proper trousers instead of jeans, and he sat at the table feeling like an actor in a play he had not auditioned for, delivering lines someone else had written for a character who was not quite himself. His mother said grace in Turkish, her voice carrying the melody of prayers he had heard since childhood, and as she blessed the food and their family and their ancestors and the year to come, Imre found himself thinking of Beatrice alone in her friend's apartment, probably eating takeout or joining someone else's family celebration, excluded from this moment because he lacked the courage to include her. The thought was a splinter under his skin, irritating and impossible to ignore, and when his mother finished praying and looked at him with expectant eyes full of love and hope for a future she had already mapped out in her mind, something in Imre began to crack. They ate in near silence at first, the food genuinely excellent, his mother watching him with satisfaction as he took second helpings of the lamb she had slow-cooked with apricots and spices, and he complimented her effusively because she needed the compliments, and because the food deserved them, and because filling the air with words about cooking was easier than confronting the conversation they needed to have. But as the meal progressed, and the candles burned lower, and his mother began reminiscing about Christmas Eve's past, about his father who had been gone now for 15 years, about the family they had lost, and the traditions they struggled to maintain across the distance of miles and generations, Imre felt the weight of his silence becoming unbearable. His mother spoke of how proud his father would be of him, of how much she wished he could see the man Imre had become, and then she said something that stopped his heart. She said she knew something was wrong, knew he was hiding something from her, knew that the careful blankness of his apartment told a story of deliberate concealment rather than simple bachelor minimalism. Imre's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, suspended in the suddenly thick air between them, and he watched his mother's face transform from the soft nostalgia of memory to the sharp attention of a woman who had run a business and raised a child and survived a husband's death, and who had not gotten to 73 years old without learning to recognize when someone was lying to her. She had noticed things, she said, her voice calm but with an edge of hurt beneath the calm. She had noticed the second toothbrush hastily hidden in the medicine cabinet, had noticed the women's shampoo pushed to the back of the shower, had noticed the photography book that had fallen behind the couch with a Brazilian publisher's imprint, had noticed her son checking his phone constantly and smiling at messages he quickly hid, had noticed the way he steered her away from certain neighborhoods, certain cafes, certain conversations. She had not said anything because she had been waiting for him to tell her himself, waiting for him to trust her the way she had always trusted him, and the fact that he hadn't, the fact that he was still sitting here pretending, hurt her more than any foreign girlfriend ever could. The silence that followed her words was the loudest silence Imre had ever experienced, a roaring absence of sound that seemed to press against his eardrums, while his mind raced through the implications of what she had said, through the realization that his mother had known, at least partially, for days, that she had been giving him opportunities to confess that he had steadfastly refused to take. He opened his mouth to speak, to finally tell her the truth, but what came out instead was a deflection, a minimization, a cowardly half-confession that yes, he had been seeing someone, but it wasn't serious, it was just casual, it wasn't anything she needed to worry about. The disappointment in his mother's eyes was worse than anger would have been, a deep sadness that seemed to age her face by years in the flickering candlelight, and she set down her fork with the deliberate precision of someone trying very hard to maintain control of her emotions. She told him that she had not raised him to be a liar, had not raised him to be ashamed of the people he loved, had not raised him to treat women, any women, as secrets to be hidden away when convenient. Whatever he thought of her, whatever traditional values he assumed she held, she was still his mother, still deserved his honesty, still needed to believe that the son she had sacrificed so much for trusted her enough to tell her the truth about his life. Her voice broke on the last words, a crack in the formidable facade she had maintained since her arrival, and Imre watched in horror as tears began to slide down his mother's cheeks. This woman who he had seen cry perhaps twice in his entire life, who wore her strength like armor against a world that had taken so much from her. The sight of her tears undid something in him, broke through the elaborate justifications he had constructed around his cowardice, and before he could think better of it, before he could calculate the risks and consequences, the truth began to pour out of him like water through a broken dam. Her name was Beatriz, he said, and she was Brazilian, and he had met her 8 months ago at a cafe in Chiado, and she was a photographer, and she was brilliant and kind and challenging and beautiful, and he loved her. He loved her in a way he had never loved anyone before, and she was not here right now because he had asked her to leave, had asked her to hide, had been too afraid of this exact moment to include her in their holiday celebration. And he was sorry, he was so sorry, he was ashamed of himself in ways he didn't have words for. The confession kept coming, 8 months of hidden truth, rushing out in a flood of words and tears. He didn't remember starting to cry, telling his mother about the life he had been living, the apartment that was really their apartment, the future he had been imagining with this woman she had never met, the fear that had kept him silent, the love that could no longer be contained by that fear. Sheriff listened without interrupting, her own tears drying as she absorbed the enormity of what her son was telling her, her face passing through expressions Imre couldn't quite read: shock, hurt, calculation, something that might have been understanding. When he finally fell silent, emptied of secrets, the candles had burned down to stubs, and the food on their plates had grown cold, and the apartment seemed to hold its breath waiting for his mother's response. What she said surprised him more than anything else that had happened that evening. She asked to see a photograph of this Beatriz, this Brazilian woman who had stolen her son's heart so thoroughly that he had tied himself in knots, trying to protect both of them from the other. Imre pulled out his phone with shaking hands, scrolled to the same photograph Beatriz had sent him the night before, the two of them at Pina Palace, laughing, in love, unquestionably together, and handed it to his mother like an offering on an altar. Sheriff studied the image for a long time, her face unreadable, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were wet again, but her voice was steady. She said that Beatriz was beautiful, that Imre looked happier in this photograph than she had seen him look in years, that she had many questions and reservations and concerns, but that none of them mattered as much as her son's happiness, that she had not spent her life building a fortune and maintaining a family legacy, only to lose her only child to her own inflexibility. It was not acceptance, not yet, not fully. There was too much history, too much cultural weight, too much to process in a single evening. But it was an opening, a crack in the door he had assumed would remain forever closed, and Imre felt something in his chest that he slowly recognized as hope. His mother asked when she could meet this woman, and Imre, still reeling from the unexpected direction of the conversation, found himself reaching for his phone to call Beatriz before he could overthink it, before the fear could reassert itself, before he could find another reason to delay the inevitable. Beatriz answered on the second ring, her voice cautious and hopeful, and Imre heard himself asking if she would come to his apartment, right now, on Christmas Eve, to meet his mother who wanted to meet her. And the silence on the other end of the line was filled with everything they had both been holding for days. The 45 minutes between Imre's phone call and Beatriz's arrival at the apartment were among the longest of his life, stretched and distorted by anxiety until each minute felt like an hour, each second an eternity of anticipation and dread. His mother had retreated to the bathroom to compose herself, to repair the damage her tears had done to her carefully applied makeup, to transform herself back into the formidable Sheriff Yilmaz who faced the world with perfect presentation and unshakable confidence. Emre cleared the dinner dishes with mechanical movements, his hands operating independently of his racing mind, stacking plates and wrapping leftovers while his thoughts cycled through every possible scenario for the meeting that was about to occur. The best cases where his mother would embrace Beatriz immediately and all would be well. The worst cases where old prejudices would emerge and everything he loved would crumble. The most likely cases somewhere in the complicated middle where nothing would be resolved, but everything would be changed. He texted Beatriz 3 times during her journey across the city, asking if she was okay, if she was nervous, if she was sure she wanted to do this tonight, and her responses were brief and practical. She was in a taxi, she was fine, she would see him soon, which told him she was probably more anxious than she was admitting. When his mother emerged from the bathroom, her face restored to its usual immaculate state, but her eyes still slightly red around the edges. She began issuing instructions with the authority of someone who had organized hundreds of business meetings and social events in her lifetime. The apartment needed tidying, the remaining food should be reheated in case their guest was hungry, there should be tea ready because hospitality required tea, and for heaven's sake, Emre should change his shirt because he had spilled sauce on it, and she would not have her son's girlfriend's first impression be of a man who could not eat without making a mess of himself. The ordinary domesticity of these instructions, the familiar pattern of his mother taking charge of a situation, was oddly comforting in its normalcy, a reminder that beneath the extraordinary circumstances of this evening, they were still themselves, still mother and son, still capable of functioning even when the ground beneath their feet had shifted. Emre changed his shirt, straightened the cushions on the couch, wiped down the already clean kitchen counter, and tried to breathe through the tightness in his chest that would not ease no matter how many times he told himself that the worst was over, that his mother knew the truth now and had not disowned him, that whatever happened next was manageable because the lie was no longer between them. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:45, and Emre felt his heart lurch into his throat as he walked to the door on legs that suddenly seemed uncertain of how to function, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle, his entire future condensed into this single moment of opening a door to let 2 worlds collide. Beatriz stood in the hallway looking more beautiful than he had ever seen her, which was saying something because he found her beautiful in all her forms, first thing in the morning with sleep-tangled hair, concentrating on her editing with a furrow between her brows, laughing at his terrible jokes, angry at his cowardice, all of it beautiful in ways that still took his breath away. She had dressed carefully for this meeting, he could tell, wearing the green dress he had told her he loved, her dark hair falling in waves past her shoulders, her makeup subtle but perfect, her expression a complicated mixture of hope and fear, and love and determination that he recognized, because he imagined it mirrored his own. For a moment they simply looked at each other, 8 months of relationship suspended in the space between their bodies, and then Beatriz smiled that smile that had captured him from the very first day, and Emre felt something release in his chest, some tension he had been carrying for days, finally loosening its grip. He took her hand and led her into the apartment, into the warmth and the lingering smell of his mother's cooking and the candlelight that had somehow survived the emotional upheaval of the evening. And there was his mother, standing in the middle of the living room with her hands clasped in front of her like a queen receiving a foreign dignitary, her posture perfect, her expression controlled, her eyes sharp and assessing. The moment stretched as the 2 women took each other's measure, Beatriz's hand tightening around Emre's fingers, his mother's chin lifting almost imperceptibly in that way she had when she was preparing to pass judgment. And Emre found himself holding his breath as if breathing might somehow disrupt the delicate equilibrium of this first encounter. It was Beatriz who broke the silence, stepping forward and extending her hand while addressing his mother in surprisingly decent Turkish, basic phrases, clearly rehearsed, but the effort behind them unmistakable. She said she was honored to meet her, said she had heard so much about her, said she hoped they could get to know each other. The shock on Sherif's face was visible even through her careful composure, her eyebrows rising slightly, her mouth parting in surprise before she recovered herself and took Beatrice's hand. And when she spoke, her voice was warmer than Emre had dared to hope, saying that her Turkish was impressive and asking how long she had been studying. Beatrice explained that she had been learning for 3 months, ever since Emre had first told her about his family, ever since she had realized that if they were to have a future, she would need to build bridges across the cultural divide that separated them. And something in this revelation seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room, seemed to tell Sherif things about this woman's character that went beyond appearances and assumptions. They sat together in the living room, the three of them, and Emre watched as his mother and his girlfriend began the careful dance of getting to know each other. Questions asked and answered about families and backgrounds and hopes and dreams, about how they had met and when and where, about Beatrice's work as a photographer and her journey from Sao Paulo to Lisbon, about the life Emre had built in Portugal that his mother was only now truly seeing for the first time. It was not entirely comfortable. There were moments of tension, moments when cultural misunderstandings threatened to derail the conversation, moments when Sherif's questions bordered on interrogation and Beatrice's patience visibly strained. But it was real, it was honest, it was the beginning of something that had been impossible just hours before. Emre found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, sharing pieces of his life in Lisbon that he had kept hidden from his mother, integrating the two worlds he had kept so carefully separate. And with each shared story, each moment of connection, he felt the walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble in the best possible way. His mother asked to see Beatrice's photography, and Beatrice pulled up her portfolio on her phone, explaining each image with the passion and expertise that had made Emre fall in love with her artist's eye. And Sherif listened with genuine attention, asking questions that revealed her own appreciation for visual arts, finding common ground in unexpected places. When Beatrice showed her a photograph she had taken of Emre at a market in Cascais, candid, unposed, catching him in a moment of pure, unguarded happiness, Sherif was quiet for a long moment before saying that she had not seen that expression on her son's face since he was a little boy, before life had taught him to be guarded, before the weight of expectations had taught him to hide himself. The observation hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and when Emre looked at his mother, he saw something in her eyes that he had not expected to see. She was looking at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years, as if the existence of Beatrice and the truth he had finally told had revealed aspects of her son she had not known were there. The evening continued past midnight, past Christmas Eve into Christmas Day, the conversation flowing from topic to topic, from Turkish tea to Brazilian coffee to Portuguese pastéis de nata that Beatrice had brought as a peace offering, and somewhere in those hours, something fundamental changed in the relationship between all three of them. Sherif was not suddenly transformed into a different person. She still had reservations about her son dating a foreign woman, still worried about the practical challenges they would face, still harbored hopes for grandchildren raised with Turkish traditions. But she was listening, genuinely listening, to the possibility that her son's happiness might look different than she had imagined. That love might cross borders she had assumed were fixed. When Beatrice finally said she should go, that she had imposed enough on their family holiday, Sherif surprised everyone including herself by insisting that she stay, that there was a spare room, that Christmas morning should not be spent alone when there was family. And the word hung in the air for a moment before landing, the first acknowledgement that Beatrice might someday be more than just her son's girlfriend. Emre walked Beatrice to the spare room, the room where he had hidden all evidence of her existence just days before, and they stood together in the doorway, overwhelmed by the evening's impossible turns, unable to find words adequate to what they had just experienced. Beatrice told him she was proud of him, that she knew how hard it had been, that she loved him more in this moment than she ever had before. And Emre held her and buried his face in her hair and thanked whatever forces in the universe had given him another chance to be the man she deserved. Christmas morning dawned grey and drizzling over Lisbon, the kind of soft winter rain that seemed to wash the city clean and make its colors glow more vividly against the muted sky. And Emre woke on the couch to the sound of voices in the kitchen, his mother and Beatriz, speaking to each other in a mixture of Portuguese and the few Turkish phrases Beatriz knew and the English they used when other languages failed them. He lay still for a moment, disoriented by the strangeness and rightness of this sound, by the reality of these two women who had never met before last night, now collaborating on what smelled like breakfast in his small kitchen, by the impossible situation he had somehow stumbled into through a combination of cowardice and confession and luck he did not deserve. When he finally made his way to the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes and feeling oddly vulnerable in his wrinkled clothes from the night before, he found a scene that would have been unimaginable just 48 hours ago. His mother was showing Beatriz how to make menemen, the Turkish scrambled eggs with tomatoes and peppers that had been his favorite breakfast since childhood, while Beatriz was teaching his mother the correct way to prepare Brazilian coffee, the two of them moving around each other with an ease that suggested they had been doing this for years rather than hours. Beatriz saw him first and smiled that smile that still made his heart skip, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, one of his mother's aprons tied around her waist, a spot of tomato on her cheek that he wanted to kiss away. And she said good morning in Turkish, the words accented but increasingly confident, and then in Portuguese, and then in English, covering all the linguistic bases of their complicated trinational morning. His mother turned and appraised him with the critical eye of a woman who had opinions about her son's sleeping habits and personal grooming. But beneath the criticism was a softness he had rarely seen directed at him, a tenderness that suggested the conversations of the night before had changed something in her as much as in him. They ate breakfast together at the small table by the window, the rain pattering against the glass, the apartment warm with the smells of coffee and eggs, and the fresh bread Beatriz had run out to buy from the bakery down the street. And the conversation flowed more easily than Emre would have believed possible, finding rhythms and patterns that accommodated three people with three different backgrounds and three different relationships to each other. Sherif asked Beatriz about her family in Sao Paulo, about her grandmother, who she had mentioned the night before, about the traditions she missed and the new ones she was building in Portugal. And Beatriz answered with the openness and warmth that was fundamental to her nature, sharing stories of her childhood, of her journey to Lisbon, of her dreams for the future that Emre heard her speak about with new specificity, because now they could be spoken about openly, without the shadow of secrecy that had hung over them for so long. In turn, Beatriz asked Sherif about Istanbul, about the business she had run, about Imre's father, who she had clearly loved deeply, about the life she had lived and the losses she had suffered, and his mother answered with a candor that surprised Imre, revealing pieces of herself he had never known, grief and joy, and struggle that she had kept locked away behind her formidable exterior. He listened to them talk, these two women who represented such different parts of his life and his heart, and felt something healing in his chest, some wound he had not realized he was carrying beginning to close for the first time in years. After breakfast, they opened the small gifts they had for each other. Emre had bought his mother a beautiful azulejo-patterned scarf from a local artisan. His mother had brought him clothes and Turkish delights from Istanbul. And Beatriz had prepared a photo album of images from Emre's life in Lisbon that she had secretly been compiling, including photographs of places that were meaningful to him, of his business, of his apartment, of the city he had made his home. Sherif studied each photograph with the attention of someone seeing her son's life truly for the first time, and when she reached the images of Emre and Beatriz together, the candid shots, the posed portraits, the everyday moments that documented their relationship, she paused on each one, her expression thoughtful rather than critical, absorbing the evidence of her son's happiness with something that looked increasingly like acceptance. She said finally that Beatriz had a remarkable eye, that the photographs captured not just images but emotions, that she could see why Emre had fallen in love with someone who saw the world this way, and the compliment, genuine, hard-won, meaningful, made Beatrice's eyes fill with tears. She quickly blinked away. The day unfolded in small moments of connection and discovery, the three of them exploring the apartment that was now revealed in its true state, Beatrice's belongings reclaimed from the spare room closet and restored to their proper places, the photography books back on the shelves, the Brazilian flag magnet returned to the refrigerator, the evidence of their shared life no longer hidden but celebrated. Sheriff asked questions about the photographs on display, about the objects that revealed Beatrice's presence, about the life they had built together that she was only now being allowed to see, and each question was an opportunity for storytelling, for building the bridges of understanding that had been impossible while secrets stood between them. They walked through Lisbon in the afternoon, the rain having cleared to reveal a washed-clean city glittering under pale winter sunshine, and Emre took them to the café where he and Beatrice had met, to the gallery where her photographs were displayed, to the hidden corners and favorite spots that made up the geography of their love. His mother walked between them, her arms linked through both of theirs, asking questions about each location, learning the story of their relationship through the places where it had unfolded. And Emre watched her face as she absorbed the depth and reality of what her son had found in this city she had always somewhat resented for taking him away from her. At the gallery, Sheriff stood for a long time in front of Beatrice's featured series, photographs of immigrant communities in Lisbon, of people from different countries building new lives in this old city, of the intersections of culture and tradition and change that defined modern Portugal. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet with something that might have been recognition. She said that she understood now, understood something about why Emre had stayed, why Beatrice had come, why people left the places they knew for places that were strange and hard and full of possibility. And the understanding was painful because it meant accepting that her son's life was here now, really here, in a way she had been refusing to see. That evening, sitting in a restaurant overlooking the river, watching the lights of Lisbon reflect on the water as the sun set behind the hills, Sheriff raised her glass of Portuguese wine and proposed a toast that made Imre's throat tighten with emotion. She toasted to family, she said, in all its complicated forms, to love that crossed borders and traditions and expectations, to her son who had found happiness she could see now was real, to Beatrice who had shown courage in coming to meet her and patience in earning her respect, to new beginnings and old relationships transformed by honesty. They clinked glasses, the sound bright against the murmur of the restaurant and the distant sound of fado drifting from somewhere, and Emre caught Beatrice's eye across the table and saw in her expression a mirror of his own overwhelming gratitude, his own disbelieving joy that this Christmas, which had begun with panic and deception, was ending with something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. His mother was not transformed. She would still have opinions, still push boundaries, still hold onto hopes and expectations that might conflict with their choices. But she was present, engaged, willing to see Beatrice as a person rather than a problem, and that willingness was more than Emre had dared to hope for when this impossible week began. As they walked back through the Christmas-lit streets of Lisbon, his mother asking Beatrice about the best places to buy Portuguese ceramics for her friends back home, Emre allowed himself to imagine a future he had kept locked away in the deepest parts of his heart. Family dinners that included Beatrice, visits to Istanbul where she would meet his extended family, perhaps children someday who would speak 3 languages and belong to 3 cultures, a life built on the foundation of truth rather than concealment. The walk home was longer than necessary, none of them wanting the evening to end, the magic of this Christmas holding them in its spell, and when they finally reached the apartment and said their goodnights and Beatrice kissed him softly before retreating to the spare room, Emre sat alone in the living room for a while, watching the city lights through the window, feeling something he had not felt since he was a child. The uncomplicated certainty that things were going to be okay, that love was enough, that courage, even courage that came late, even courage that had to be pushed to emergence by circumstance, was still courage, and it had changed everything. The days between Christmas and New Year passed in a haze of discovery and negotiation, of three people from different worlds learning to coexist in the small space of Imre's apartment, of conversations that ranged from superficial pleasantries to deep revelations that changed how they understood each other. Sherif extended her stay, postponing her return to Istanbul twice, claiming she wanted to see more of Lisbon, but really, Imre knew, wanting to spend more time observing this relationship, she was slowly coming to accept, testing its foundations, satisfying herself that her son had chosen well, even if his choice was not what she would have chosen for him. There were difficult moments, arguments about the future, about where Imre and Beatriz would eventually settle, about whether potential grandchildren would be raised with Turkish traditions, about the practical challenges of a relationship that bridged 3 cultures and 2 continents. But the difficult moments were navigated rather than avoided, addressed with a directness that was new in Imre's relationship with his mother. A directness that Beatriz modeled and Imre learned to practice. He found himself speaking truths he had never voiced, telling his mother about the years of feeling suffocated by her expectations, about the relief of building a life in Portugal where he could define himself on his own terms, about the fear that had kept him silent about Beatriz for so long and the shame he felt about that fear. And his mother listened in ways she had never listened before, her defenses lowered by the shock of revelation, her understanding deepening even when it was painful. Beatriz and Sherif developed their own relationship independent of Imre, spending hours together while he worked, exploring the city, shopping for ceramics and souvenirs, communicating through their patchwork of languages and the universal language of gesture and expression, finding unexpected commonalities. Both were women who had survived difficult circumstances through strength and determination. Both valued family above almost everything else. Both loved Imre in their different ways and wanted his happiness even when they disagreed about what that happiness should look like. Imre would come home from his warehouse to find them bent over Beatriz's camera, his mother asking questions about photography technique that she actually seemed interested in, or sitting at the kitchen table with Portuguese phrase books and Turkish vocabulary cards, teaching each other the words for things that mattered to them. The sight of it, this impossible friendship forming between the women he had thought could never coexist, moved him in ways he could not articulate, vindication and gratitude and hope tangled together in his chest. New Year's Eve arrived with the promise of fireworks over the river and the traditional Portuguese custom of eating 12 raisins at midnight for 12 wishes in the coming year. And Imre decided that this night, this threshold between years, was the moment to do something he had been thinking about since Christmas. He had spoken to his mother the day before, asking her blessing in a conversation that was formal and awkward in its tradition, but necessary for what he planned. And Sherif had cried, different tears from Christmas Eve, happy tears, accepting tears, and given her blessing with stipulations and hopes and warnings that were so typically her that Imre had laughed and hugged her, and felt the last barrier between them finally crumble. The ring was in his pocket all evening, a simple band with a stone that echoed the green of the dress Beatriz had worn to meet his mother, purchased from a Portuguese jeweler who specialized in designs that mixed traditional and contemporary elements, and it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, burning through the fabric of his trousers, demanding to be produced. They watched the fireworks from a rooftop bar Imre had reserved weeks ago, the 3 of them bundled against the December cold, champagne glasses in hand, the city spread out below them like a glittering carpet. And when the first explosions of color lit up the sky over the Tagus, Imre took Beatriz's hand and pulled her slightly away from where his mother stood pretending not to watch. The moment he had imagined for weeks was upon him, the words he had practiced forgotten, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she could hear it over the boom of the fireworks. And yet when he spoke, the words came easily, naturally, the truest words he had ever spoken. He told her that 8 months ago she had walked into a cafe and into his life, and he had known immediately, terrifyingly, that nothing would ever be the same. He told her that he had handled things badly, had let fear make him small and dishonest, had asked her to hide when he should have been proudly introducing her to everyone who mattered, and he would spend the rest of his life making that up to her if she would let him. He told her that watching her with his mother over the past week had shown him what their future could look like, complicated and challenging and bridging cultures and requiring constant work, but rich and full and more than worth the effort. He told her he loved her in Portuguese and in Turkish and in the English that served as their bridge language, and then he was on one knee on the rooftop with the fireworks exploding behind him, the ring box open in his hands, asking her in all three languages if she would marry him and build that complicated, beautiful future together. Beatrice's face in the multicolored light of the fireworks was everything, shock and joy and tears and laughter all at once, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes bright with the reflected explosions and with emotion that words could not contain. And when she finally managed to speak, it was a single word repeated in three languages. Yes, yes, Sim, Eved, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, the stone catching the red and gold and green of the fireworks, and then she was in his arms and they were kissing while the sky exploded above them, and his mother was crying again somewhere behind them, and strangers at nearby tables were applauding and shouting felicidades. When they finally pulled apart, Sheriff was there, pulling them both into an embrace that surprised Imre with its fierceness, welcoming Beatrice to the family in Turkish words that she didn't fully understand, but that needed no translation. And the three of them stood on that rooftop holding each other while the new year began around them. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning and celebration, of phone calls to Beatrice's family in Brazil, who welcomed the news with the warmth and enthusiasm that was characteristically theirs, of video calls to Emre's extended family in Istanbul, who reacted with varying degrees of surprise and acceptance, of practical conversations about wedding logistics and where to live and how to navigate the bureaucracy of three countries. Sheriff returned to Istanbul in mid-January, but her departure was different from any that had come before. There were tears and tight embraces and promises to return soon. There were plans already forming for the wedding and for future visits in both directions. There was a connection between her and Beatrice that had become real and would only deepen with time. Standing at the airport, watching his mother walk toward her gate with the determined stride of a woman who had faced down boardrooms and grief, and the challenge of accepting a future she hadn't planned, Imre felt something settle into place in his chest. Some question he hadn't known he was asking finally answered. He had spent 5 years building a life in Portugal, but he had built it on a foundation of separation, keeping his two worlds apart because he believed they could not coexist, believing that choosing one meant losing the other. The weeks since Christmas had shown him how wrong he had been, how the courage he had lacked for so long, the courage to be honest, to be vulnerable, to trust that love could bridge the gaps he had assumed were permanent, had opened doors he thought were forever closed. Beatrice squeezed his hand as his mother disappeared into the crowd of travelers, and when he looked at her, at the ring glinting on her finger, at the face that had become his definition of home, he understood that the choice he had made on Christmas Eve, the choice to stand up and tell the truth, to stop hiding the woman he loved, had not been a choice between his mother and Beatrice at all. It had been a choice to stop being afraid, to stop letting his cowardice dictate the shape of his life, to believe that honesty and love were stronger than the walls he had built to protect himself. The future stretched out ahead of them, complicated and uncertain and requiring constant navigation between cultures and languages and expectations. But for the first time since he had left Istanbul 5 years ago, Imre felt whole, felt integrated, felt like all the pieces of himself finally fit together. He would marry Beatrice in Lisbon next spring, with Portuguese friends and Turkish family and Brazilian relatives all in attendance, with his mother helping to plan the ceremony and Beatrice's grandmother flying in to give her blessing, with 3 languages spoken and 3 traditions honored and 1 love celebrated. He would continue building his business, with Beatrice's photography increasingly featured in their marketing, her artist's eye finding beauty in the specialty foods he imported. They would visit Istanbul together, exploring the city of his childhood through her photographer's lens, and they would visit Sao Paulo, where he would eat his future grandmother-in-law's rabanada and learn the rhythms of Brazilian hospitality. They would build a family, eventually children who would grow up trilingual and multicultural, who would celebrate Christmas and Bayram and Brazilian holidays with equal enthusiasm, who would learn from their parents that belonging to multiple worlds was not a burden but a gift. And through it all, Emre would remember this Christmas in Lisbon, the Christmas when everything changed, when his mother arrived unannounced and forced a crisis he had been avoiding for months, when he finally found the courage to tell the truth, when he stood up at a Christmas Eve dinner and chose love over fear. He would remember the terror of that confession and the unexpected grace of his mother's response, the first meeting between the two women he loved most, and the relationship they built in the days that followed, the rooftop proposal and the fireworks, and the beginning of a future he had once believed was impossible. He would remember, most of all, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, that honesty is not always easy, but is always necessary, that the families we are born into and the families we choose can learn to love each other if we give them the chance. As he and Beatriz walked out of the airport into the January sunshine, toward their car and their apartment and their life together, Emre felt the last remnants of his old fear dissolve like morning mist over the Tagus, replaced by something stronger and more enduring. The certainty that he had finally become the man he wanted to be, the man Beatriz deserved, the man his mother could be proud of not for his achievements or his conformity, but for his courage and his love. The hidden girlfriend was hidden no more, the family dinner had become a turning point rather than a disaster, and the choice he had made to stand up and speak the truth had changed everything, proving that it is never too late to be brave, never too late to be honest, never too late to let love win.